I'm working on the beard part. Hopefully before too long it'll be down there by my... I wanted to ask you all, before we started here, how many of you are homeschool, teach your children at home? Raise your hands if you homeschool. How many of you have a church school that you go to? How many of you do something other than a church school or a homeschool? Okay, now I have another question for you. Why don't you put your children on the yellow school bus that goes past your driveway? I don't know if it does here in Minnesota or not. That will take your children and educate them for free. I want to hear answers for this question, and I'd like to discuss with you all later, but I want you to think about that question. Why don't you educate your children the way most of the world educates their children? And another question I want to ask you, what in your mind is education? When you think of the word education, you think about educating your children, what does that mean to you? And then also with that question, I'm going to ask these questions. These are questions I want you to think about, and I want you to ask yourselves, and I want to discuss this as we keep going. I'm not sure how much time we're going to have for discussion because it's hard for me to stop talking when I get started, but I hope very much to have a little time. So why don't you put your children on the yellow school bus? What in your mind is education? And how do you, what is success with education? Like how do you think, this education was successful? Now, Jesus, when he walked this earth, right in the beginning of his ministry, he's walking along and two people walk up behind him. He turns around to them and he asks them a very interesting, a profound question. And the question is, what are you looking for? What do you want? And I think when I talk to parents all over the world about education and about their children and about the hows and the whys of education, and I ask them that question, what do you want in the education of your children? Think about that question and answer it in your heart, because that's a really important question, because you generally get what you want deep inside. You make decisions, when you choose, you choose to get what you want, and you better want the right thing. Because if you get what you want, it might not be what you thought it was. Now, we'll deal with all that a lot later in these talks, but before we start in that, I want to give you a little history of Christian education, and before I give you the history, I want to give you some principles that education hangs on. And they're biblical principles. They're principles that lay the foundation for why we think of education and what education means. So education, in a nutshell, is passing on the values of one generation to the next generation. That's a successful education. And that's the same to a Muslim, the same to a Hindu, the same to a Mennonite, the same to the same to a gay couple in Eugene, Oregon. They want to pass on their values, no matter what they say. I want my child to think like me because I think the right way. We want to pass on our values. So how do we think about it? So there's three principles I want to talk about. The first principle, what you feed will grow. So in North Carolina, I am raising a sheep, and it's to help support my teaching habit. And sheep, they eat and they get out of fences, and they're amazing creatures. If you put them in a pasture like I have them in now, that's just full of weeds and grass and sticks and leaves, they eat and they're fat and they're full and they're happy. The pasture they were in before this was mainly rocks and dirt, and sheep don't perform well and have a lot of babies on rocks and dirt. It's more of a skinny, wormy situation, but they grow well on grass. And I like to look at farming and sheep and chickens and goats, and what you feed something, what you feed it will help it grow. And if you feed it good things, it'll grow. And if you feed it bad things, it won't grow. What you feed grows, and what will starve dies. This is a principle I want you to think about when you think about education. Now, in your children, every person, there are two spirits. And one is good, and this is maybe an oversimplified way of thinking about it. One is good and holy, and when you feed it good things, we feed it stories, we feed it good ideas, we feed it example, we feed it hard work, and it grows. It's a good spirit. There's a bad spirit, and a dark, the old man, the Bible calls it. And when you feed it bad things, it'll grow. And whatever spirit you feed is what will grow. The things that your children see and hear are the things that will feed their spirits. And what they see and hear will feed their spirits. Whether if it's good, it'll feed the good. If it's bad, it'll feed the bad. Very simple. So in my little house in North Carolina, in my shop, I have a little shop in the middle of the wilderness, and with my sheep and my lovely wife. And in my shop last winter, I had a problem of mice that were just overrunning my lovely little house, and they were everywhere. And I killed them by the dozens. I spread out poison. I put out traps and sticky traps, and I caught, I don't know, like 6 mice on one sticky trap. And I where are these mice coming from? I can't stop them. I can't even slow them down. I catch one, and there's 4 more to fill their place. And so I cleaned my shop after a long last, and I not cleaned it, but sort of, and found bags of corn that I was going to be feeding deer at some point in my career and hadn't fed them to the deer. And the mice had nearly finished them. And that's why they were doing so well. They had just all the feed in the world, and you can't stop a mouse population like that without stopping their feed, right? And you can't get rid of them because they're being fed. And I say, when you see things in your children's lives, I spend a lot of time in Romania talking to parents who are losing their children to the world because they're going to a worldly education system. They're going to public schools, and I talk to them about their children, and they can't stop the growth of evil in their children's life. Their children come home and they're violent and disrespectful, and what they're being fed is what's growing. And you're not going to change the bad things in your children's life unless you change the feed and stop the bad feed. So we're talking now about education, we're talking about Christian education, and we're talking about the whys of Christian education before we get into the practical things. And this first point, I want you to think about what you feed grows. And your children aren't going to go and get fed bad things, wrong things, bad videos, bad influence, bad other, and expect them to grow good fruit. I think that's something it's very simple. What you feed grows. The second thing the second principle of education that I want us to understand is this. It's the responsibility of the parents to educate their children. When God gave you children, He gave you the responsibility to raise them for Him, to prepare them for life. It's not the state, it's not the church. Ephesians 6:4 says, "Fathers, don't stir up anger in your children, but bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord." Deuteronomy, in chapter 6, it talks about fathers. Train your children when you're sitting down, when you're walking on the road, when you're standing up, it's your responsibility. The devil has his ways. He has many ways. We know the ways. We're surrounded in the world by the ways of the devil, that he would love to educate your children for free, but you can't take this way. Your responsibility as parents to raise your children. So we have what you feed grows, whose responsibility it is to raise your children, and then the third principle that I want us to remember is a student will be like his teacher. Now, in North Carolina, many years ago, about 100 years ago, a little over 100 years ago, the Outer Banks were not settled. I don't know if you've ever been to the Outer Banks. It's a little ring of islands along the coast of North Carolina. Well, it's in one of the most dangerous parts of the ocean in the world. The graveyard of the Atlantic is offshore of the Outer Banks, and it's a long, shallow ocean area where ships that come in close get blown into the sandbars and break apart, and there are thousands upon thousands of wrecks out out there. Well, people hundreds of years ago put lighthouses up to show the ships where the deep channels were, and they would dredge the channels out so they're deep enough to accommodate a ship. And there's an island on the Outer Banks called Bodie Island, owned by the Bodie family for many, many years. And on Bodie Island, there's a lighthouse, the Bodie Island Lighthouse. Well, about a little over 100 years ago, there was a group of people that lived on Bodie Island that manned the lighthouse, and they were pirates. And they would wait and for night and a storm and darkness, and they would go climb the lighthouse, and they would take the lamp out of the lighthouse, take it down the steps, and tie it to the neck of an old horse that they had along the that they had there, and they would look out in the ocean for the lights of a ship, and they would wait until a ship saw the light on the beach, and because from a ship you can hardly tell, is the light in the lighthouse or is it on the shore? All they can see in the darkness is the light, and they would wait, see the ship, saw the light, see the ship's lights out there, see the ship coming in, and they would lead the horse down the beach. A few hundred yards is all it took, and the ship captain out there following the light would turn his ship and follow the light of the lighthouse and run into a sandbar, and all the pirates would jump into their longboats and row out there to the ship and get all the people and kill them all and take all their things. And they were making a good living that way for many, many years, until somebody smelled a bit of a rat there, and the U.S. government Coast Guard sent a ship full of Marines, and they came out there and they followed the light into a sandbar, the same as all the other people. But when the longboats came out there to kill them all and take their things, the Marines killed all the pirates. And they came up to the shore, and they found the horse, and they cut off its head, and they put it on a post. And they called that area of the beach to this day Nag's Head, if you ever go and visit there. Jesus said profound words, and I want you to remember these words. He said, "Can the blind lead the blind?" Then he answers his own question, "No, because they'll both fall into the ditch." Then he says these words, profound words, "A student will be like his teacher when he's fully taught." I think if I could, the main reason we don't send our children we teach our own children, or we teach them spiritual truth by ourselves, is that very fact. A student will be like his teacher. A teacher is a lighthouse. It's either showing you the right way or showing you the wrong way, and children will follow. Deeply affected by their teachers. I taught school in Bangladesh for many years, in the government schools of Bangladesh, and my students were Muslim. And taught all different age levels from 6th grade to college, and their parents sent them to me to learn English, and they came to me to learn English, and their teachers told them, they said, "Go to him and learn English, because he's the best English teacher you'll ever see," because they don't have very good options for English teachers, obviously. And but don't listen to him about the Jesus side of things. He's a Christian. We know he's a Christian. Don't listen to him about that side. Learn his English, but don't take the rest of the teaching. And so one day I was in my class, and one of my students, she was a girl, and I didn't know if she was a Muslim or a Hindu. I had some Hindu students, and I wanted to ask her, what she is, so I can give her the right Bible storybook or Bible. I don't forget what I gave them that year. There's a little difference in Bangla in the Hindu and Muslim version. So I asked her, I said, "Are you a Hindu or a Muslim?" Just in the middle of class. And she said, "Well, she's a Hindu." And okay, that's great. So a little later she raised her hand. She's like, "Actually, Aaron, sir," she said, she's a Christian. She just wants me to know that seeing me being their teacher, she's a Christian. There's nothing else for her. And just about all the rest of the class raised their hands and said, "We're all Christians too." And there's nothing their parents could say or do that could counter. And that was the Holy Spirit, without a shadow of a doubt. But influence of a teacher. We think of education a little bit like something you can go to the store and get. Like I can go to Walmart and I can get education like I would buy an apple. I can come away from Walmart with this education. I can come away from school. I can come away from this teacher with this education thing, and I'm equipped for life with this tool. That's not actually how education works. Education is a way teachers pass on who they are, their ideals, their values. A student will become like his teacher. And who is teaching your children? Ask yourself that question. Would you be happy with your children growing up to be just like their teachers? Jesus knew the influence of a teacher. He could have come to earth as anything in the world, as a king, as a priest, as a preacher, and he came as a teacher. He knew the influence a teacher can have. How many of you are ministers or preachers of some stripe here? Have a few. How many hours would you say you have a week with your congregation, that you're teaching your congregation? Two hours? 2, 3, 4, 5? How many do you think a school teacher has? It's 40 plus. There's not even a shadow of a comparison between the influence of a preacher and the influence of a teacher. I told our ministry at home that, and I actually believe this. I feel like I would love to see older people in the classroom more. I told our ministry that maybe if they follow God with all the faith they can and do His will to the best of their ability, when they're 50 or so, they could graduate from preacher to teacher and have that much more influence. You can't. It blows me away the influence that you see in communities with good godly teachers. We want our children to be successful. We want them to have good jobs. We want them to get money, support families. We want all these things. But we want them to have a complete education. But if you lose your children to a wrong ideal, to the world, to sin, to the devil, in the process of getting educated, we have lost everything and we've gained nothing. If we gain the whole world and lose your own soul, there's no profit. Is your children's teacher leading them closer to God or farther away? Now, these 3 principles we have, and then I want to go into just a little bit of history here. We have what you feed grows. Think about that. What are your children getting fed? What are they eating? What spirit is growing? Whose responsibility is it to teach your children? It is your responsibility as parents. It's not the government. It's not the church. It's not something other. It's your responsibility to make sure your children are being educated for the Lord. And you can do that at home. You can do that in a church school, but you can't turn your child over to the devil to get educated and expect to keep him. It's interesting. In Romania, I've taught in dozens and dozens of communities, very large conservative Pentecostal communities. One of the largest probably has, I'm going to say in that one community, there's maybe 6,000 or 7,000 children going to school. And in that community, there's about 60 or 70 of them who are not going to public school. And it's interesting, the families who are taking upon themselves the responsibility of educating their own children and teaching them about God, and with a Christian curriculum and a Christian teacher, almost all their children are growing up to be faithful Anabaptists. I don't know of a single one conservative Pentecostal that have deviated and gone into the world. The rest of them, the 98% that haven't taken that route for their family, are losing about 80 or 90% of their children to the world. But they have lots of children, so they feel like that's worth the risk because they don't have to do the work. It's tragedy. Now, these 3 principles are the difference between a Christian education and a worldly education. The history of Christian education is basically a story of the war between Christian ideals and worldly ideals. A Christian education is about preparing a child for the kingdom of God. to be a builder in the kingdom of God. The world wants a citizen. It wants somebody that'll go with the program and work hard and do their thing. And the goals are completely opposite. We're part of a different kingdom. We're part of a different... And this war that has happened, one of the places where this is, this war between the light and the darkness, the devil and the church, one of the places that it comes in bold relief is in this thing of education. Who educates my children? And all real Christians have fought this war successfully. I would love to talk to you if you have any more thoughts about this afterward. But this war with education started with the early church. And we had, in the very early church, Jesus went back to heaven. This fledgling little church is here. They're trying to teach their children. They're trying to make a new way. And the world, for the first time ever, I think, was offering kind of a free government-funded education. You could basically go anywhere and get an education about like it is today, with some differences. And that period of Christian life and of history and the Christian response to the world, the Roman education of those days could be summed up like this. Somebody said, if you send your children to Caesar to be educated, don't be surprised if they come back as Romans. So they had these little schools that they put together instead of sending them to public education. And they were little, and they called them martyr schools because they were preparing them to die for God. And because that's what happened when you became a Christian. And they taught them reading, they taught them how to read the Bible, they taught them how to do math, they taught them skills to live. They didn't teach the occult texts and the mythology and the sports that the Roman schools taught. And they taught them how to suffer. They taught them how to die. They taught them they did physical exercises to strengthen their bodies to be able to hold up to persecution unto death. And they were being trained to be a citizen of a different country, not a Roman, but a citizen of heaven. And they were wildly successful. These children, they were intellectual. They learned to read. They learned to speak their faith. They learned to spread their faith. And they learned to die. And the church grew, and there was a tremendous gap between them and the world, and the kingdom of God grew. Little house schools taught by brothers and sisters in the church. It was a beautiful time. If you move forward another 1,000 years, we have the Catholic Church, and there's stories all through here of Christians choosing a different form of education. The Catholic Church said, education is our enemy. If people learn how to read, especially if they read the Bible, they're not going to go along with our program. They made the Bible illegal to read, death penalty for owning a Bible and reading it. And the churches, our Anabaptist forefathers, the Waldensians, the Huguenots in France, they said, no, we teach our children to read the Word, and they started schools. Especially the Huguenots in France, every church had a little school beside it. And they taught their children how to read the Bible, how to do whatever they needed to live work-wise. And they were so incredibly successful that the persecution of the Huguenots, the Catholic Church said, we have to stop the schools. Until we stop these schools, we can't destroy the Huguenots. We can't stop the church, because these children were growing up being taught by Huguenots, and the Waldensians were the same. Being taught by their own community. They're picking up their values. They're getting almost 100% retention rate of these children. We have to have them send us their children to teach. So the Catholic Church would they persecuted the Huguenots violently, but they would know that in this city there's a Huguenot school, and they wouldn't know where, and they wouldn't know how, and they would put their own Catholic school there. They changed their game, said we're going to have to offer an alternative, put a Catholic school there, and they said, and they tried to make every child attend the Catholic school, mandatory attendance of our, state Catholic school. And that's when some Catholic leader made that comment. He said, if you give me a child until he's 8, I'll have him for the rest of his life. And sobering thought, but it's effective. Okay, move forward another, I'm going to just go very quickly through here because I have a lot of things I want to tell you yet today. If you move forward another 100 years from this period of time, we come to America and we come to a state system of schools, and how that went from private to state is an interesting story in itself, but we come in the 1950s and 40s and 50s and 60s, we have a state-run education system here in America that everybody sent their children to. Whoever you were, you went to the government schools, and the government schools weren't that bad. They taught God, they prayed, they had the Bible. It was not a bad system. But as in the 1940s and 50s, there was a divergence from God-centered schooling and evolution and wrong teaching, and interestingly enough, there was a sports. One of the things that pulled the Anabaptist churches out of the public school was the sports situation and immodest dress in the sports. Some of my uncles were involved with that in Buchanan County, Iowa. I don't know if you've ever read that little book Lamp and Light just wrote, The Church in the Cornfield. There's it's a story of a school. I mean, a school in the cornfield. It's a little school in the middle of Iowa where my uncles, one of them was Aiden Yutzi, my great uncles, Jonas Yoder, Wallace Miller, a bunch of Amish, some Amish from here from Wisconsin. They said our children aren't going to go to the public schools. They can't go there because the public schools made a rule that the girls had to wear short shorts in their physical exercise. And I said, no, it's not happening. Not happening. So they said, we're going to start our own school. And they started their own school. And the police came to try to shut it down and tried to catch all the children. And they ran into the cornfield and they couldn't catch them. And it was a great little story. But they ended up going to the Supreme Court through that whole thing, a war on this. Who's responsible to educate our children? Who's responsible to educate my children? And the Amish said, those brethren said, it's us. And Mennonites and all over the country, they said, no, it's our responsibility. And anyway, this court case got tried, and we know the outcome. This Jonas Yoder versus the state of Wisconsin was judged in favor of Jonas Yoder. And the Supreme Court, they sent people out to the Amish communities there in Buchanan County, and they looked at what they were doing and looked at all the things they were doing, and they came back, and their recommendation to the Supreme Court was that these people are actually doing a good job teaching their children. They have values, their communities, there's something of value here that's worth passing on. And the Supreme Court went with that and let them do their own thing, which actually was constitutional. I wonder what they would find now in some of our communities. If they would go there and look, would they say we're successfully teaching our children value, or are we falling behind? So after that whole court case happened, there was the legal thing was kind of over. We were allowed in all states to have to educate your own children. There's different loopholes and different hardships in different states, but every state you are allowed to teach your own children. But the early years of Mennonites and Amish trying to run their own schools were hard. They didn't know how their frame of reference was public education. They didn't know about how to do boards. They didn't know how to do teachers. And it was hard. It was a struggle. Disagreed violently on how schools should be run, but they kept going. And one of the things that they faced, one of the hardest things they faced, is other Mennonites. This is especially in the Mennonite circles, other Mennonites saying that it was stupid. So in Franconia, Pennsylvania, where my dad's side of the family comes from, my mom was Amish, my dad was Mennonite, and the worlds converged there. But in those massive old Mennonite churches there in Pennsylvania, about 1 or 2% of the people said, let's try a different route with education. All the rest of them said, we can go and get our education from the world and keep our children, and it's not worth the effort. And they said this to my great relatives back there. They said, if you don't send your children to the public schools, they won't get a good education. Number one, you won't be able to afford it. Number two, and your children won't be adjusted to live in the world that is around them. Those are the arguments that they had, and interestingly enough, those are the same arguments I hear all over the world. We just did a series of meetings in Kenya, same story. Our children, we can't afford it. They will get a good... What do you want out of your children? At the end of the day, that's the question you need to answer yourself. The people in Pennsylvania years ago, when they were told they couldn't do it, they said, no, we want our children to be in heaven with us. At the end of the day, we want our children to make it to heaven. That's what we care about. And if we don't get that, we've lost the fight, right? The rest of them said, no, there's, we want, and they lost their children. There's a dear brother in Romania, Ili Petroniac, and I taught some of his children. He has a number of children. He about 10 years ago, he got Christian-like materials, and he started teaching his children, because that's the only way to legally do it in Romania, be enrolled in a foreign school, and et cetera, et cetera. He didn't know English. The curriculum was all in English. He ordered the books and started teaching his children at home, learning English with them, and Google Translate together, and it was impossible. And all the rest of his church said, you are a fool. You are, you are a fool. They'll never get educated. They'll never, this is impossible what you're doing. And it was impossible. I'm not going to argue with that, but he had the Spirit of God with him, and I was just in their home not very long ago, and his children alone in the church are faithful. And the rest of them, most of the rest of the children aren't faithful. And if I would have something up here to draw, I would show you the graph. In the Franconia Church in Pennsylvania, when there was the 1 or 2% of people pulled out of that system into a different type of system, a conservative, hold on to values kind of system, educate our own children kind of system, don't send our children to the world kind of system, that about 1 or 2% have maintained something of value through the years, through the decades. And the 98, the 97% that didn't, haven't maintained value. They've lost where they're at today. I think we could all look at them, wherever we're at on the spectrum of conservative, liberal, and say, this is not, they haven't maintained value. They haven't kept value. You're not going to keep value for your children unless you take responsibility to make sure they're being taught your values. If you let somebody else teach them values, wrong values, you won't keep them. The church in Romania, they're in a terrible situation now. They were persecuted violently during the Soviet time of Romania. Richard Wurmbrand, many of them, they died in prison, and now, but they survived that with flying colors. They lasted. Their children were faithful, but now they are losing their children to the world nearly completely, and a lot of it is through that education. So what are some things that we learned trying to do schools? We learned a lot of things. We learned things about curriculum. I don't know what curriculum you use. Be careful what you use. There's a lot of wrong curriculums out there, a lot of unhelpful curriculums out there. Teachers. Teaching your teachers how to teach effectively. We haven't done very good at that traditionally as Mennonites. We need to do better at that. We're going to talk about that in another session here. A student will be like his teacher. Do we realize that? Do we think about that? Do we make sure they're doing a good job? And one of the things that it's different in different communities, but I visited a lot of Mennonite schools over the country, and there's a lot of value in small, single church schools. It's not, as a teacher, it's easy for me to think multiple churches, if I could just have a single grade or even just a single subject, say science, or I could just teach 5th grade science, or even just 5th grade, it makes a lot more sense from an educational perspective, but it isn't good at building community. What you try to get to in your in your school, at your church, you're trying to get to a place where the children who go to your school are the same ones that play ball together, that play volleyball together, and they're the same ones that end up sitting in the men's meeting together and making church decisions, and the preacher was their teacher, and they've learned to work as a team together. We're trying to build a community. We're trying to pass on values, and smaller single community schools do a lot better job at that traditionally than big multiple community conglomerations. And I don't know how, maybe some of you are involved in a multiple church school, and it's not the end of the world. Some of my dear friends teach in those. But when we think of retaining value, passing on value, that's not been very effective for that. We don't have a feeling of belonging. Children don't have as much of a feeling of belonging to their local church. This is us. That's a good feeling. It's a good thing to teach. So I want to tell you a little. One of the last times I was in Bangladesh, I did some interpreting work and went and I was talking to one of my friends there, and he said, "Would you want to come and see a temple? An old temple?" And I said, "Yeah, I'd love to go see an old temple." So we went, and I walked with it. We drove a little rig over there, and well, first he said, "Do you want to see an old palace?" And I said, "Yeah, I want to see the palace first." So we went to get to the palace, and it was this big grassy field. And I said, "This doesn't look much like a palace to me." He said, "Oh no, the palace has been torn down, 500 years ago." He said, "But this is where it was." Okay, that's a great landmark here. He said, "But if you do want to see the bathtub, you can come and see the bathtub." Okay, let's see the bathtub. So we went and we looked, and there was the bathtub, and it was a gigantic bathtub. You could have dropped this building into one corner of it, and it would have not filled up the one corner. It was a huge sunken brick bathtub. It's where the king and all his people bathed. And it was. I looked at that, and I thought that the world and all of this has disappeared except for an old brick bathtub. The palace is gone. The people are gone from this world, but every single one of those souls are still alive. All of them, from the gardener to the slave to the whoever it was, they're all still alive. And I was thinking about that, and he said, "Would you want to go to the temple next door?" I said, "Yeah, I'd love to go to the temple." So we went to the temple, and we're there walking around the temple, and it's an old temple, crumbling brick and falling down, and out in front there's this altar. And I said, what do you sacrifice here on this altar? And it helps to speak Bangla. I don't think they would have ever told me this stuff if I hadn't been speaking to them and friends with them, or got to be friends with them. But they said, until a few years ago, we sacrificed children on the altar. Young children. It's what we did. And I said, "Do you still do that?" No, we don't. One of the old priests there was like, "Yeah, sometimes we still have to sacrifice a child." So my whole heart was just full of just sickness. This was old Hindu, the god Kali, one of the evil demons, gods of the Hindu religion. That was her temple. And sacrificing children. Anyway, I was thinking about that, and we were walking away, and it was just, my heart was sick as I thought of children dying on this altar. And then I thought of America, and I thought of children in America. And I think whenever there's something, there's a throne in every one of your hearts. And if there's something on that throne that's other than God, if there's anything on that throne that's other than God, it can be wants, it can be material things, it can be, I don't know what it can be our own selves. But when there's a void there instead of God, we will end up sacrificing our own children. That's the conclusion of the matter. And it's not just aborting them and things like that. It's children growing up without roots and without teaching. And it's a sacrifice the same way. It's a different altar, but it's the same sacrifice. And we kept going from there, and he said, do you want to see the world's largest tree? I said, well, yeah, I'd love to see the world's largest tree. So far, so good. And so we kept on going, and we came to this little grove of trees. And it was maybe 2 or 3 acres fenced off, and it was just a grove of trees. And I said, where's the largest tree? He said, it's right here. This is the tree. And I said, it looks to me like a little forest. And he said, no, it's all connected. And so we went and looked, and it was a baobab tree. And the baobabs have a big central trunk, but then they send out branches, and the branches drop down roots, and the roots sprout and grow into a trunk. And then they send out more branches, and they drop down another root. And it can be 40 feet in the air and drop a root down, and when it hits the ground there, it sprouts, and then it swells up and grows into a trunk. And it was really neat. And all those trees were in there connected. And somebody had come in there in the last few hundred years and cut down the center baobab tree. And they'd cut down a lot of those trees for building and whatever else they did, but they couldn't stop them. They kept right on going. They built roads around them, and they shot limbs over the road and dropped roots down, and just kept going. I just thought, what a beautiful thing. In a world where the devil is chopping and cutting, and the church is trying to grow and spread, and there's just, it cuts down, but you just keep going, and you teach your children, and you send another root down, and it goes on and keeps building and keeps going. And we can be like that tree if things are cutting. Now, and then as I was sitting there looking at the tree and thinking about the children and the altar and my teaching over there, and it's demoralizing to teach in Bangladesh because your children are Muslims and some Hindus, and most of them, you look at them and you hope some of them are going to make it to heaven, but the chances, there's no community often there. There's a lot of churches springing up there now, but you look at these children and you love them, and am I going to see you in heaven? I don't know. And and it can destroy you if you let it. Anyway, when I was sitting there, I saw on the side of the tree, I saw a mushroom. And there was the mushroom, and it was and the sun came out. It was a rainy season, so it was pouring down rain all the time, but the sun came out and shone down on the mushroom a little beam of sunlight, and the mushroom started to smoke on the underneath of the mushroom. It looked like smoke, just curling away from the bottom of the mushroom. And looked at that. Why would the mushroom be smoking? And it wasn't smoke. It was little spores. I held my hand underneath there, and it got a little dusty black on it. And it was spores from the mushroom. And the longer the sun shone on, the more spores went. And it was literally a little cloud of spores, just millions and millions and millions of spores. And I think sometimes we're like the mushroom. We need to be so full of God that it's just spilling out of us in words and actions and teaching, and those seeds God takes and he lodges them in hearts and minds and places, and they sprout. They're God's job once they leave you, but we have to be faithful to be spreading those spores as we go. So I have a little, do you have any questions or thoughts about this? I have a lot of things to share in some of these future talks, but before we go on, do you have any thoughts about what I said?
Do you have any curriculums that you like specifically?
Okay, that's a very good question. What curriculums do you all use? A scattering of, do you use a BECA, rod and staff, CLE?
Some of all of them, I think.
Yeah. So I'm a CLE rep. One of the things that I do, it's actually a very small part of what we do, but it is one of the things. But before I was a CLE rep, I'm a big proponent of CLE, and I would say before that I'm a proponent of Anabaptist curriculum. But the reason that I recommend CLE is because academically it's very rigorous. I was teaching in a school where we switched cold turkey from a BECA, almost all a BECA, to almost all CLE. And it was interesting. It was a rocky little change because curriculums are at different places. But at the end of the year, I went and looked at the records of the school, and it wasn't a large school, 60, 70 students maybe, something like that. But I just looked at the records, and you could tell there was and a couple years later, I went back and looked too, and there was just an uptick when we switched to CLE. And the reason that we had that is not that ABECA is farther behind academically than CLE, but there's a different method of teaching. In ABECA and Rodenstaff and Saxon and a lot of the others, they teach in chapter chunks. So let's say we're talking about language or English, that when you get to the adverb chapter is a chunk on adverbs. You get done with the adverb chapter and you kind of leave adverbs sit and you go to adjectives. And then when you're done with the adjectives, you leave that sit and you go on to nouns. And when you get to the end of the book, you do your final exams, you really haven't reviewed the adverbs for a long time. And so it's kind of rusty and they don't score very well on it in these big chunks of learning. Well, CLE has a spiral method, is what it's called, but every lesson has a little bit of each thing in it. It teaches a little bit of adverbs, teaches a little bit of essay, teaches a little bit of adjective, and it reviews all that stuff and teaches one more new little concept. And in doing that, it keeps the whole works fresh in the student's mind. You review basically everything every 2 weeks. And so you get to the end and you sit down for your achievement tests and you know it, you've just done this stuff, and and they retain it way better in the future too. Now I say that for skill subjects, I highly recommend math and language arts and reading, CLE. Social studies, the upper grades of social studies 6, 7, and 8 are fantastic. Some of the others need a little work, maybe, but the science, we don't have a good science curriculum yet. 5th grade science, I think, is the only one that's finished, and it's very good. But I mean, I would recommend doing Apologia or ABECA science. But I don't know, if you're going to be teaching in your school, you use Anabaptist curriculum. We didn't used to have very good options for that, and we still don't have options for every subject. But I think we're making mistakes academically and for a lot of other reasons to be using something other than CLE and Rodenstaff, if you like Rodenstaff. For a lot of the skill subjects, and I don't know. You're welcome to disagree with me on that. That's probably not an official CLE stance, but that's my personal opinion. You know, I talked to I was staying with a family in Romania one time, and the lady said they chose to go with ABECA in for their children's curriculum. I said, well, I'm just interested. Why did you choose ABECA? And they said, well, we looked it up online. We compared CLE and ABECA, and ABECA was a lot more expensive, and so we thought CLE. I mean, we thought ABECA must be better than CLE if it's that much more expensive. I said, well, I can help you with that problem. We can charge you more for the curriculum. It's not an issue, but anyway, do you have more thoughts on that?
What do you think about Ken Ham's?
The creation?
Yeah.
Is it just science?
I think he gets more than science.
It's called Masterbook. It's his curriculum.
Masterbook. Okay, I don't know. I'm not very familiar with that. It's probably good. I don't know.
I like your history book, but other than that, we did not do any other.
I see. That'd be worth checking into. There are a lot of good curriculums out there. There really are. I think I like Anabaptist curriculums when and where they fit, and I think. Like CLE and Rodenstaff, I think they do a really good job. But I think there are a lot of other really good options. Living Threads is history. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but like for younger grades, that's a tremendous history course. One of the maybe the best ones that I've ever seen for younger grades. But I don't know. Any more thoughts? Did that kind of answer your question, or yeah?
Thank you.
Who's producing Living Threads?
I think Faith Builders. I think they put that together. But it's tremendous. One of the problems with our history curriculums tend to be the great gaps we have in placing things in history, in the living run of history. We're not very good at that with a lot of the curriculums, but I think Living Threads helps do that at a young age where they can get. And I don't know. There's no premium on being a dummy. I feel like to teach your children something academically rigorous and make them work for it and is a good thing. But I haven't ever seen. I was there in Harrisonburg working for a while, and right across the road was Eastern Mennonite University. And of all the universities, the conservative Mennonite universities that tried to do it right, they tried their very hardest to do it right. They had the board, some of the original charters of that board were amazing, absolutely amazing. The things they said they were going to hold on to, they were going to do, they were going to keep, they were going to have, and they didn't. I think of all from Heston College to there to all the Mennonite universities of the world, I think Eastern Mennonite College there, I think, is probably the worst. They're aggressively pushing a transgender, gay agenda. It's an anti-value, anti-God thing. And I've done a lot of reading and research on school history and how that's affected the church. And you probably have different opinions on this than me, and that's perfectly fine. But I have never seen a case where a push for higher education for higher education's sake has been a friend of conservative values. I know a good friend of mine is a doctor, and he's a conservative Christian, Anabaptist. And I think he grew up, and when he was an older person, he, with the blessing of his church, went on and did some schooling and became a doctor. And I think in his case, it was a beautiful thing. It worked well. But just to send your young people, when they should be surrounded by a good influence and a good peer group, and a 19, 20, 21, 25 is not really a good time to be trying to chart your life, and to just head from high school into a higher education scenario has not been a friend to. I was talking to a preacher over in Romania, and he said, if my little girl goes on to, if she does CLE like you're saying I should, or something other than this public education like you're saying I should do, will she be able to go to a university when she's done? I said, well, academically, yes, she can. I said, but is that really what you want? Think about what you experienced when you went to university. He'd just been out a few years. I said, do you want your daughter to go back there and have the same influence? And his eyes just got great big. He's like, absolutely not. And I think, be honest with yourselves. Be honest with your thinking about your children. And you're welcome to disagree with me about that if you want. But the higher education of this country is not a place to send your children. The influence there. One of my good friends in North Carolina, a professor, he said one of his fellow professors there, he said that he guarantees, and he's never had it fail, after 6 months of taking his class, every student will be an atheist. And I think we're fools to send our children to them to be taught. But any more thoughts on that? And some of you may have gone to the university to a university and survived. And I'm not. God can do anything. One of in Romania, one of the brethren there told me. He said, "You're completely wrong." He said, when Moses was in Pharaoh's court, and he grew up in Pharaoh's court, and that influence, and look at how he turned out. It's just an amazing man. And I think it's not a very good. Number one, I think it took God 40 years in the wilderness to take Pharaoh's court back out of him. And the other thing is, I think he's an exception. I don't think we need to grow up in Pharaoh's court is not a great spot for your children. Any more thoughts? I'm probably not going to have very much discussion time in the rest of the classes here, but anyway, so if you have anything you really disagree with me on so far, or you want to clarify, just say it now. So there's and butt in if you want to. So there's a story in the Bible. There's Jesus, and he's and I tell this to you because I tell this story to you because you're teachers, your parents, you're passing on something of value to your children. You're trying. The fact that you're here shows that you care about your family and you want values passed on and all these things. But it's a lot of work and it's overwhelming. And Jesus, he's surrounded by hungry people, and there's 5,000 of them, and they're crying for food, or they're hungry. And his disciples said, and Jesus said we should feed these people. And the disciples said, well, we don't have enough money. We need more money. And Jesus asked them, what do you have? Not what you can get, but what do you have? And they said, well, we have 5 loaves and 2 fish. And with Jesus, it was enough. He made that tiny offering enough for all those people. Only with Jesus. It's the same with us. But I want you to think a little bit about the bread. And so you have this bread, and the fish too, but I like to think about the bread. And Jesus is there, and he blesses it, and he starts to break it. It's interesting that it says that. And he breaks it, and then he breaks it, and then he breaks it some more, and he breaks it and breaks it. And he breaks it until all of those people have been fed. And I think sometimes we're maybe a little bit like that bread. Only when we're broken can God use us to feed the hungry. But we can choose not to break. We can choose to follow our own agendas. We can choose to we can choose not to break. But Jesus said you must be broken. And I think to be used in His kingdom, we have to be broken. And when we are broken, God will see the people, your children, and your fellows in your church, and the people you're trying to educate will see God through the breaking. And the hungry will be fed. And you can be truly whole. God bless you all very richly as you teach your children, educate your children, and I'm so excited for the rest of this week to share with you some more things about education. God bless you all very richly. Yes?
Excuse me, I just have a question. Can you tell us a little bit about the books, the little storybooks out there? Or did you bring those?
I did not bring those.
Oh, I just figured they were from you.
Which storybooks are they?
Richie's still talking about that.
Oh, okay.
Okay, very good. I just about stopped at CLE on the way here and got a bunch of materials. I was just traveling somewhere else. I don't have any materials to give you. I have words, a lot of words, so that's about all I have to offer you. And some stories. I can't wait to give you some stories. Yes?
Can you give us a real quick overview of your ministry, how long you were in Bangladesh, or anywhere else? Was it primarily teaching English?
So I taught school in North Carolina, in Oregon for 3 years, and then I taught school in Bangladesh, and that was in a Mennonite school of 60-some student Mennonite school, a very normal, traditional Mennonite school. Good, great, wonderful place, Halsey, Oregon. And then I went to Bangladesh for 5 years and taught in their schools over in Bangladesh, and then I came from Bangladesh, then COVID kind of shut that down, and I went to Romania and spent a lot of time in Romania trying to help there's a conservative Pentecostal group in Romania numbering in probably the hundreds of thousands who survived persecution in a terrible way, and now are losing by leaps and bounds to just worldly influence. Romania joined the European Union, and their schools changed, and it's just turned into a dark and terrible place. And so I've been there many times trying to give them another option. Say there's another. It's number one, it's your responsibility to teach your children, and number two, there's something you can do about it. And so far, I'm going to say maybe there's 800 homeschool families in Romania, and they're trying to transition from homeschool to church school, just sheerly because of resources. I think homeschooling is wonderful. Those of you that homeschool, it's a tremendous way of doing school. But there's some resource things where you have one teacher teaching 10 children or 20 or whatever number you pick in a church school, where it's better, it's easier on resources, especially when English is limited. So we do that, and then we were recruited by CLE about 2 years ago to be their international school rep, whatever that means. We don't even know for sure, but we try. Our goal, we go to places where Christian communities, at whatever stage they're at, are trying to educate their own children and help them be successful in that. How does a school look? How do you train a teacher? How do you, how do you come up with a board? How do you, all of those things. And that's been tremendously delightful and hard work. And I think there's schools starting up, Christian schools in a number of places in Africa, Papua New Guinea, Romania, all of Europe actually, and smatterings through Asia. I think this idea of teaching your own children is and with the English language too, it's a door into a lot of these places, conservative Muslim places, that it's a tremendously effective door to walk through. But we're trying to equip them to do their own instead of doing it for them. God bless you all very much.